Chapter 1. Invisible in the crowd. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows over the city streets, reflecting off the towering buildings that made New York feel like it was always in motion. Times Square, the city's epicenter, was as alive as ever. Neon signs flashed ads in every direction, drawing the eyes of tourists and locals alike. Yet, among the chaos and noise, one man sat unnoticed on the edge of the bustling sidewalks, a ghost among the living. Daryl sat cross-legged on the pavement, his hands resting on a dirty tin cup in front of him. His eyes scanned the thousands of feet walking past, never making eye contact, never stopping. To them, he was just part of the cityscape, another faceless, nameless person struggling to survive. He hadn't always been this way. Once, Daryl had been a man with a family, a job, and a home. But that life was long gone, stolen piece by a series of unfortunate events that had snowballed out of control. Losing his job led to losing his house. Losing his house meant losing his family. And, as if that weren't enough, losing his family led to him losing himself. The noise of the city felt distant to Daryl as his stomach growled painfully. It had been 2 days since he had eaten anything substantial, and the small change in his cup wasn't enough for more than a scrap of food. His hands trembled from exhaustion and hunger, but he refused to beg outright. Pride, though diminished, was the one thing he still held on to. He wasn't ready to let go of it entirely, but today, hunger was winning the battle. Across the street, the glow of a restaurant sign caught Daryl's eye. He had seen it before, a fancy place with white tablecloths and people who looked like they belonged somewhere far removed from his world. The thought of entering a place like that seemed ridiculous, but desperation was a powerful motivator. Without another thought, Daryl stood, his legs shaking beneath him, and began to cross the street. As he approached the entrance, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass door. His beard had grown wild and untamed, his clothes were tattered, and his skin was dirty from months on the streets. The sight of himself made him pause for a moment, shame creeping up his spine, but he pushed it down. There was no room for shame when you were starving. Chapter 2. The man at the door. Daryl took a deep breath and stepped inside the restaurant, immediately feeling out of place. The clinking of silverware, the low hum of conversation, and the pristine white tablecloths created an atmosphere that was far removed from the chaos of the street he had just left behind. A waiter, wearing a perfectly pressed white shirt and black tie, approached him with a polite, yet slightly confused, expression. "Sir, can I help you?" the waiter asked, his tone measured, but there was a subtle hint of disdain in his eyes as he looked Daryl up and down. Daryl swallowed hard, his throat dry. He hadn't spoken much to anyone in weeks, and the words felt foreign on his tongue. I just need something to eat," he mumbled, his voice barely rising above the ambient noise of the restaurant. The waiter's expression changed, and for a moment, Daryl thought he saw a flicker of pity in the man's eyes. But that flicker quickly disappeared, replaced by a tight-lipped smile. "I'm sorry, but we don't offer free meals here," the waiter said. Daryl's face flushed with embarrassment. He wasn't asking for a handout, at least, he hadn't meant to. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of crumpled change. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. "I can pay," he said quickly, his voice tinged with desperation. The waiter looked at the coins in Daryl's hand with thinly veiled disdain. "Sir, I think it's best if you leave," the waiter said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the door. Daryl's heart sank. The weight of rejection pressed down on him, and he could feel the eyes of the patrons in the restaurant turning toward him, their gazes sharp and judgmental. He had become visible for the first time in a long time, but not in the way he had hoped. As he turned to leave, he heard someone else approach. The manager, a man with a stern expression and arms folded across his chest, was walking toward him. "Is there a problem here?" the manager asked, his tone implying that there had better not be. Daryl shook his head, feeling the sting of humiliation grow stronger. "No problem," he muttered, stepping toward the door. "You need to leave," the manager said firmly. "And if you don't, we'll have to call the police." The words hit Daryl like a punch to the gut. He hadn't done anything wrong. He wasn't causing a scene. All he wanted was a meal. But now, he was being threatened with the police, and he knew better than to argue. with his head down, Darrell walked out of the restaurant, back into the cacophony of the city. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. He hadn't made it more than a few steps before he felt a hand grab his arm. Chapter 3, Confrontation on the Street. "Hey, you." Darrell turned to see two police officers standing behind him. One of them, a tall man with broad shoulders and a stern expression, had his hand on Darrell's arm. The other officer, slightly shorter but no less imposing, stood with his hand resting on the handle of his baton. "We got a call about someone causing a disturbance at the restaurant," the taller officer said, his voice hard. Darrell felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. He hadn't caused any trouble. He hadn't even raised his voice. But he knew how these situations could go. He had seen it before, innocent men getting dragged away in handcuffs for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. "I wasn't causing trouble," Darrell said quietly, keeping his eyes down. I just wanted something to eat." The shorter officer, who had been watching him closely, looked him up and down, taking in the torn clothes and the dirty face. "You can't just walk into places like that, man," he said, his tone softer but no less authoritative. "You've got to find another way." Darrell nodded, his heart sinking further. He knew they were right. It had been foolish of him to think he could get a meal in a place like that. He wasn't like the people who ate in fancy restaurants. He was nothing more than a homeless man, and this city had no mercy for people like him. "All right, come on," the taller officer said, reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. "We'll take you in." Darrell's eyes widened. "Wait, please," he began, but it was too late. The cold metal of the cuffs clicked around his wrists, and any hope of avoiding this situation slipped away. The officers led Darrell toward their squad car, their grip on his arms firm. As they walked, Darrell felt the stares of the passers-by, their faces filled with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. To them, he was just another criminal, another problem for the city to deal with. They reached the car, and the taller officer opened the back door, pushing Darrell inside. He sat in silence as the door closed behind him, the weight of his situation pressing down on him like a physical burden. As the officers climbed into the front seat, Darrell stared out the window, watching the city blur past. He didn't know where they were taking him, maybe the station, maybe a shelter. It didn't matter. He had nowhere to go, nowhere to be. Chapter 4, a glimmer of hope. The drive seemed to last forever, though it was likely only a few minutes. Finally, the car came to a stop, and Darrell heard the click of the front doors as the officers stepped out. He didn't bother looking up. What was the point? "Come on, out of the car," the taller officer said, opening the door and motioning for Darrell to step out. Darrell complied, his wrists still cuffed, though his heart was heavy with resignation. As he looked around, he realized they weren't at the police station. They were in front of a small diner, the kind with a neon sign in the window advertising cheap coffee and pancakes. The officer removed Darrell's handcuffs, much to his surprise. "Are you hungry?" the officer asked, his voice no longer as hard as it had been before. Darrell blinked in confusion. "What? You said you were hungry," the officer continued. "Go inside. Get yourself something to eat." Darrell's mouth opened, but no words came out. Was this real? Was he dreaming? He had been prepared for the worst, another night in a cold cell, another day without food. But instead, the officer was offering him a meal. "Go on," the officer said, nudging him toward the door. "It's on me." Darrell hesitated for a moment before nodding. He couldn't find the words to express his gratitude, so he simply walked inside the diner. The warmth and smell of food hit him instantly, making his stomach growl loudly. He sat down at the counter, still unsure of what was happening. The waitress approached, and before he could say anything, the officer handed her a few bills. "Get him whatever he wants," the officer said with a nod before turning to leave. As the door closed behind him, Darrell looked at the menu in front of him. It had been so long since he'd had the luxury of choosing what to eat. His hands trembled as he ordered a plate of pancakes, bacon, and eggs, the first real meal he'd had in months. Chapter 5, Redemption begins. The next morning, Darryl woke up in a shelter, the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. He had slept better than he had in months, his stomach full for the first time in what felt like forever. The events of the previous day still lingered in his mind, especially the unexpected kindness from the police officer. He sat up in his bed, the thin mattress creaking beneath him. Outside, the city was already awake, its streets filled with the sounds of people going about their daily lives. Darryl wasn't sure what the future held for him, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Hope.it wasn't much, but it was enough to start. Ban ko thay dong nai kong, kan malagan hok het han plus t nan tin veo zalo nai, 08686.01263. Banda noi teep tucket to noi, ChatGPT Chapter 6. Finding a way forward. Days passed after the incident at the diner. Darryl found himself thinking often about that police officer, the one who had treated him with kindness instead of contempt. It wasn't something he was used to, but it had given him something he hadn't had in a long time, a reason to believe that there might still be good in the world. With the hunger no longer gnawing at his stomach, Darryl was able to think more clearly. He realized he couldn't keep living the way he had been. If he stayed on the streets, if he kept relying on the occasional act of kindness or the change people threw into his cup, his future would be nothing but more of the same. And so, Darryl made a decision. He would change. The first step was finding a place to stay that wasn't just for the night. The shelter had been helpful, giving him food and a bed, but it was temporary, and Darryl knew he needed something permanent if he wanted to rebuild his life. He began asking around the shelter, talking to the other men who stayed there. Some of them had been in his shoes before, and many had found ways to get back on their feet. One man, a former construction worker named Jimmy, told Darryl about a program that helped homeless people find work and housing. "It ain't much," Jimmy had said, "but it's better than sleeping out in the cold." Darryl decided to check it out. The next day, he went to the community center where the program was being held. The building was old and a little run down, but it was warm, and there were people inside who wanted to help. He sat through a long orientation session where they explained how the program worked. It was simple, really. They helped you find a job, and once you had some steady income, they helped you get into affordable housing. For the first time in years, Darryl felt like he had a plan. Chapter 7. The first step. The next few weeks were hard, harder than Darryl had expected. He had forgotten what it felt like to have a schedule, to be responsible for showing up somewhere every day. The program placed him in a job at a local community center, cleaning the building and helping set up for events. It wasn't glamorous work, but Darryl didn't care. It was work, and it paid. At first, the routine was exhausting. His body wasn't used to the physical labor, and his mind struggled to stay focused. But each day got a little easier. The other workers at the community center were kind, and they didn't judge him for where he'd come from. In fact, many of them had their own stories of hardship, people who had lost jobs, families, or homes. Darryl realized he wasn't alone, and that made the weight of his situation a little easier to bear. One evening, after a long day of work, Darryl sat at the bus stop, waiting for the ride back to the shelter. He had a few dollars in his pocket from his paycheck, and for the first time, he thought about what he might do with it. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a hot meal or maybe even a new pair of socks, something small, but something for himself. As he sat there, the memory of that police officer came back to him. Darryl wondered if he would ever see him again. He had never gotten the man's name, but he felt a strange sense of gratitude toward him. That simple act of buying him a meal had set off a chain of events that was slowly changing his life. "I'll thank him someday," Darryl whispered to himself as the bus pulled up to the curb. Chapter 8. Small victories. Time passed, and Darryl's life began to stabilize. The job at the community center became more permanent, and with the help of the program, he was able to move into a small, one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't much, a bed, a table, and a chair, but it was his. No more shelters, no more sleeping on the street. The first night in his new place, Darryl lay on the mattress, staring up at the ceiling. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet after the constant noise of the streets and shelters. But it was peaceful, and that peace felt like something he hadn't experienced in a long time. That he smiled to himself as he thought about how far he had come. It wasn't just the physical changes, having a place to live, a job to go to every day. It was the change inside of him. The despair that had weighed him down for so long was beginning to lift. He didn't feel hopeless anymore. For the first time in years, Daryl allowed himself to think about the future, not just surviving, but actually living. The next few months were full of small victories. Daryl saved up enough money to buy new clothes. He reconnected with an old friend who helped him get back in touch with his daughter. They had a long road to rebuilding their relationship, but just hearing her voice again was enough to make Daryl believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be good again. Chapter 9, Crossing Paths. One day, while Daryl was working at the community center, a group of police officers came in for a meeting. They often used the building for community outreach events, and Daryl was used to seeing them around. But on this day, as he was setting up chairs for their meeting, he saw a familiar face. It was the officer from the diner. Daryl froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. The officer didn't seem to recognize him at first. After all, Daryl looked very different now. He wasn't the same ragged man who had been sitting in the back of the police car months ago. But as Daryl walked past, carrying a stack of chairs, the officer's eyes flickered with recognition. "Hey," the officer said, stepping forward. "Do I know you?" Daryl smiled. "Yeah, you helped me out a while back. At the diner." The officer's face lit up with realization. "I remember you. You were hungry, and yeah," Daryl interrupted, "and you bought me a meal. I never got the chance to thank you." The officer shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. I was just doing what anyone should do." "Well, it made a difference," Daryl said, his voice full of sincerity. "That meal was the first step to getting my life back together. I'm working here now, and I've got a place to live. Things are better." The officer looked at Daryl for a long moment, his face softening. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "You know, we don't always get to see how things turn out. It's good to know it made a difference." Daryl nodded. "It did. More than you know." The officer smiled and clapped Daryl on the shoulder. "Keep going, man. You've got a good thing going here." As the officer walked away, Daryl felt a sense of closure. That moment in the diner had been a turning point for him, and now, standing here in the community center where he worked, he realized just how far he had come. Chapter 10, A Future Worth Living. Months turned into years, and Daryl's life continued to improve. The community center job became full-time, and he even began mentoring others who were in the same position he had once been in. Helping people who were struggling gave Daryl a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He knew what it was like to be at rock bottom, and now he could help others find their way back up. He reconnected with his daughter, slowly rebuilding the relationship they had lost when his life had fallen apart. It wasn't easy, but they were making progress. She visited him in his new apartment, and they talked about the past, the mistakes, and the future. One evening, as Daryl sat on his couch, looking out at the city through his window, he reflected on how much had changed. The man he had been, hungry, homeless, hopeless, was gone. In his place stood someone stronger, someone who had fought his way back from the edge. It hadn't been easy, and there were still days when the weight of his past threatened to pull him down. But now, Daryl had something he hadn't had in a long time, a reason to keep going. And so, as the city lights blinked on one by one, Daryl smiled. He had found his way back, and his journey was far from over. There were still more victories to be won, more lives to touch, and more moments of joy to be had. Daryl had discovered something he thought he had lost forever, a future worth living. Chapter 11, Seeds of Change. As the months passed, Daryl found himself increasingly involved in the community. The work at the center had grown from a job into something more personal, something that gave him a sense of belonging. He knew better than most what it meant to be cast aside, invisible in a crowd. But now, with every passing day, he helped others find their footing, just as he had found his point one afternoon. The community center director, Ms. Jacobs, approached him with an opportunity. "Daryl, we're thinking of starting a program to help people transition out of homelessness," she said, her eyes thoughtful behind her glasses. "You've been through the system, and you've come out stronger. We could use your insight." Daryl looked at her, surprised. "You want me to help run it?" Ms. Jacobs nodded. "You've been working here for over a year now. People respect you. They listen to you. You've been through what they're going through, and that's invaluable. I think you could make a real difference." The idea of leading a program like that was overwhelming. Daryl hadn't thought of himself as a leader in a long time, if ever. But the more he considered it, the more it made sense. Who better to guide others than someone who had walked the same path? "I don't know if I'm qualified," Daryl said slowly, scratching the back of his neck in a mess. Jacob smiled warmly. "You're more than qualified. Experience is the best teacher, and you have plenty of it." Daryl looked around the center, at the faces of the people he had come to know. Some were still struggling, others were finding their way, just like he had. And suddenly, he realized how much he wanted to help. He had been given a second chance, and maybe this was his opportunity to pay it forward. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm with determination. Chapter 12, The hard work begins. Starting the new program wasn't easy. Daryl faced countless obstacles: limited funding, skepticism from some community members, and the sheer weight of the task ahead. But he wasn't alone. Ms. Jacobs provided guidance, and several of the other center staff threw their support behind him. The first step was finding participants, people like him who were on the verge of giving up but needed just a bit of hope to keep going. Daryl spent hours talking to people in the shelter, convincing them to join the program, to take that first step toward rebuilding their lives. Some were eager, while others were hesitant, weighed down by the same fears Daryl had once known too well: the fear of failure, the fear of being judged, and the fear of hoping for something better. "There's nothing easy about this," Daryl would tell them. "But I'm standing here in front of you because someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You deserve the same chance." His words resonated, and slowly, participants began to trickle in. Daryl structured the program around the idea of support, not just financial help, but emotional and psychological support as well. He knew from experience that it wasn't enough to simply find a job or a place to stay. People needed to heal. They needed to believe they could live differently. He worked long hours, often late into the night, planning workshops, connecting with local businesses for job placements, and coordinating mental health counseling services. It was exhausting work, but it was also deeply fulfilling. One evening, as Daryl sat at his desk, reviewing the names of the new participants, he realized how far he had come. Just a few years ago, he had been the one needing help. Now, he was the one offering it. Chapter 13, Building Bridges. The success of the program didn't go unnoticed. As more people began to find stability through Daryl's efforts, word spread throughout the community. Local businesses began offering their support, some with donations, others with job opportunities for those who completed the program. The local news even ran a story about the initiative, highlighting the impact it was having on the homeless population in the area. With every success story, Daryl felt a deep sense of pride. But he didn't let it go to his head. He knew that for every person who found their way out, there were many more still struggling, still unseen by the rest of the world. One day, while Daryl was reviewing some applications, he received a phone call from an unexpected source: the police department. "This is Officer Reynolds," the voice on the other end of the line said. "We met a while back. I helped you out at a diner." Daryl's face lit up with recognition. "I remember you," he said warmly. "You're the one who gave me that meal." Officer Reynolds chuckled. "I'm glad you remember. I've been hearing about the work you've been doing at the community center. It's impressive, Daryl." Daryl was taken aback. "Thank you. I never expected to be doing anything like this." "Well, I wanted to see if there's anything we can do to help," Officer Reynolds continued. "We've been trying to build better relationships with the homeless community, and I think what you're doing could be a great bridge between us and them. Maybe we can work together." The offer caught Daryl off guard, but it made sense. The relationship between the homeless and law enforcement had always been fraught with tension, but if they could work together, maybe things could change. Maybe they could prevent people from falling through the cracks, like Daryl almost had. I'd like that, Daryl said after a moment. I think we could really make a difference. Chapter 14, New Horizons. The collaboration with the police department was the beginning of something even bigger. Together, they started a joint initiative to address the root causes of homelessness in the city. The police offered outreach programs, helping those on the streets connect with resources before they ended up in jail. Daryl's program at the community center expanded to include crisis intervention training for officers, helping them understand the complexities of homelessness. It wasn't always smooth sailing. There were disagreements, challenges, and moments of frustration. But through it all, Daryl remained focused on the goal, helping people find their way to a better life. One day, after months of hard work, the mayor's office reached out. They had heard about the success of Daryl's program and wanted to discuss expanding it citywide. Daryl stood in front of the mayor's desk, feeling a sense of disbelief. How had he gone from being homeless to standing here, in a position of influence, discussing how to help thousands of others? You've built something incredible, the mayor said, looking at Daryl with admiration. We need more programs like this, and we want you to lead the charge. The offer was overwhelming. Daryl knew the responsibility that came with it, and part of him was scared. But he also knew that this was his chance to make an even bigger impact. I'm honored, Daryl said, his voice steady. And I'm ready. Chapter 15, Coming full circle. Years passed, and Daryl's program continued to grow, touching the lives of countless individuals across the city. The impact of his work was undeniable. He had gone from being invisible on the streets to being a symbol of hope for those who had none. But through all the success and recognition, Daryl remained grounded. He never forgot where he came from or the people who had helped him along the way. He continued to work at the community center, still mentoring those who were just starting their journey toward rebuilding their lives. One evening, as Daryl was locking up the center, he saw a man sitting on the steps outside. The man's clothes were dirty, his face lined with exhaustion. Daryl recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same look he had worn all those years ago. Daryl approached the man and sat down next to him. Hey, Daryl said gently. You okay? The man looked at Daryl, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and hopelessness. I don't know, he whispered. I don't know what to do. Daryl nodded, understanding completely. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper with the address of the shelter and the community center. Here, he said, handing it to the man. This is where you can start. You don't have to do it alone. The man took the paper, his hands trembling. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Daryl stood, offering the man a hand. Come inside, he said with a smile. We'll figure it out together. As they walked into the warmth of the community center, Daryl couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. The journey had been long, and it hadn't been easy. But standing here, helping another person take that first step, Daryl knew it had all been worth it. He had found his purpose. He had found redemption, and now, he was helping others find theirs.